The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old carnations. The steady beeping of machines was the only rhythm in Margaret Lane's world now. 78 years of strength, dignity, and independence had collapsed in an instant, betrayed by a blood clot in her brain. The stroke had left her body frail, her speech slurred, and her right side numb. She was no longer the sharp-tongued retired librarian who once hiked the Appalachian Trail for fun or debated politics over tea. She was now something she never thought she'd become: vulnerable. Through half-lidded eyes, Margaret watched as her son, Daniel, stood at the foot of her bed. He looked older than she remembered. Broader in the shoulders, shadows etched deeper into his face. His thick brown hair was streaked with premature gray, and the lines around his eyes had deepened since his last visit home 2 years ago. He hadn't come often, but now, here he was, hands clasped, a deep seriousness in his voice. "You're not going to a nursing home, Mom. I promised you when I was 13, remember?" His voice cracked slightly. "After Dad died, I said I'd take care of you, always." Margaret blinked slowly, unsure if her tear was from emotion or her body simply reacting without her consent. Her words came slowly, like pebbles dragged across gravel. "You don't have to." Daniel leaned closer, taking her hand. "Yes, I do. You took care of me when you were all alone. Now it's my turn." In the days that followed, Daniel arranged for her release with alarming efficiency. He declined the hospital's recommended rehabilitation center and filled out the paperwork for in-home care. A week later, Margaret found herself in the back seat of Daniel's car, staring out at winding roads and distant pine trees. The city slowly fell away. Suburbia gave way to fields. The landscape grew wilder, lonelier. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice still recovering. "My house," Daniel said simply. "It's quiet, peaceful. You'll get rest." As they pulled into the gravel driveway of an old, 2-story farmhouse tucked behind rows of overgrown hedges, a feeling stirred in Margaret's gut. The house looked more fortress than home, its windows tall and dark, its porch weather-beaten. Nature seemed to press against it from all sides, vines crawling up the back, like fingers trying to reclaim what had once been human. Inside, the house was sparsely decorated. No photos, no clutter, just the bare essentials. A couch, a TV, a dining table that looked like it had never hosted a meal. Daniel had set up a hospital bed in the downstairs guest room. Everything was organized, sterile, almost too perfect. Margaret said nothing. She told herself this was love. Dedication. Sacrifice. And for the first week, Daniel was all of those things. He cooked for her, bathed her gently, helped her relearn how to walk from the bed to the window. He even played old jazz records in the evenings, her favorite. They talked, or rather, he talked and she listened, slowly regaining her words. She caught glimpses of the boy he used to be, the gentle, bright-eyed child who used to cry when his goldfish died. But even early on, Margaret began to sense something beneath the surface. It started with small things. The front door was always locked. Her cell phone, meant to keep her connected with friends, never held a signal. When she asked for the landline, Daniel said he hadn't reconnected it yet. "No one uses those anymore," he said with a laugh that didn't quite meet his eyes. And then there was the door to the basement, an old iron-latched thing at the end of the hallway. Locked. Always locked. Every time she shuffled past it with her walker, she felt something tug at her memory. Something old and unfinished. One afternoon she tried the handle, just to see. Daniel appeared behind her like smoke. "That's just storage," he said too quickly. "Old junk? Nothing you need to worry about." Margaret smiled and nodded, but her hand trembled as she walked away. That night, lying in her bed beneath a crocheted blanket that wasn't hers, Margaret stared at the ceiling and whispered aloud to herself, barely audible. "You made a promise, Daniel, but what are you really keeping me from?" Outside, the wind howled across the empty fields, and from somewhere deep below in the bones of the house, something thumped softly. Once. Then, silence. The days bled into each other like watercolor on wet paper. The routine at Daniel's house was strict, almost ritualistic. Breakfast at 8, physical therapy stretches by 10, lunch at noon, and lights out by 8 p.m. sharp. There were no visitors, no sudden changes. Daniel kept things tidy, orderly, controlled. At first, Margaret told herself it was just his way of coping. He had always been a little obsessive, even as a boy, arranging his action figures by height, color-coding his school notes. She chalked it up to adult stress. After all, caring for an elderly parent wasn't easy, and yet, a gnawing unease burrowed deeper into her chest with every passing day. She noticed that Daniel never left his house empty, not completely. If he had to run errands, he made sure the caretaker from the agency he reluctantly hired stayed with her the entire time. Margaret had only met two, a stern older woman named Ruth, who barely spoke, and a timid man named Joel, who always seemed to be looking over his shoulder. Both were polite, competent, but strangely robotic. One cloudy afternoon, Margaret shuffled out of her room on her walker, moving slower than usual. Her mind was clearer now, her speech improving, her grip returning, but she hid her progress from Daniel. There was something she needed to know before she trusted him again. She passed the long hallway that led to the rear of the house. At the very end, like the period at the end of a secret sentence, sat the basement door. Wooden. Heavy, a black iron latch that looked as though it belonged in a castle, not a farmhouse. She stared at it for a long moment. She had tried the handle once more since that first time. Still locked. Something about that door didn't sit right with her. Maybe it was the way Daniel's mood changed the instant she mentioned it, or how she sometimes heard muffled sounds behind it, barely perceptible, like a shuffle or a low creak. She once thought she heard a voice, a sob or whisper, but convinced herself it was the wind outside. Or at least she tried to. Margaret took a deep breath and placed her hand on the doorknob. Cold. Metal. Solid. She pressed her ear gently against the wood. Silence. Then, was it a sigh? Hello? She whispered. Nothing. She turned to head back to her room. And froze. Daniel stood at the far end of the hallway, holding a tray of tea. His face was expressionless, but his eyes, those stormy, unblinking eyes, were fixed on her hand. Looking for something? He asked lightly, too lightly. Margaret forced a smile, masking her racing pulse. Just stretching my legs. I'm supposed to move around more, remember? Daniel walked toward her slowly, the china cups clinking faintly on the tray. That door's just full of old junk, he said, his tone casual. Tools, broken furniture. You might trip. Besides, it smells like mold down there. He handed her a cup. Chamomile, your favorite. She accepted it with a quiet nod and let him guide her back to her room, his hand firm on her elbow. That night, Margaret poured the tea into a potted plant near her bed and stared at the basement door from her window. She didn't believe him. Not about the door, not about the tea, not anymore. The next morning, while Daniel was outside chopping wood, she checked the plant. The leaves were already curling at the edges. The tea was killing it. Later that week, a nurse from the agency arrived. Someone new, a young woman named Linda. Kind smile, nervous eyes. During Margaret's assisted bath, Linda leaned in close, her voice barely audible over the running faucet. You should stop trying the door, she whispered. He knows. Margaret's heart thudded. Do you know what's behind it? Linda hesitated, then whispered something that chilled her blood. You're not the only one he's kept here. Before Margaret could ask more, Daniel's voice rang out from the hallway. Everything okay in there? Linda shot upright. Yes, all good. She dried Margaret quickly, avoiding eye contact. Margaret was left sitting in her robe, trembling. Not from cold, but from the slow creeping realization that whatever Daniel was hiding wasn't just about her. That night, as the house creaked under the pressure of the wind, Margaret stayed awake with her eyes on the hallway. The door. The nurse. The poisoned tea. The whispers. A promise was keeping her here. But a secret might be holding her prisoner. Margaret Lane awoke before sunrise, as she often did now. The house was cloaked in silence, the kind that didn't feel peaceful, it felt watched. A single beam of dawn filtered through the curtains and fell across her bedside table, illuminating the small tray Daniel left each morning. 1 glass of water, 2 oval-shaped pills, and a note written in his tight, mechanical handwriting. "Take these before breakfast. I love you. D." Margaret stared at the pills, pale pink, coated, familiar. At least, they were supposed to be. Her memory was sharper these days, and something about the shape felt wrong. She used to take round, white tablets at the hospital. The dosage was off, too. She remembered the number. She remembered everything. But she hadn't told Daniel that, because now Margaret was pretending. Each day, she acted more fragile than the day before. She slurred her words, feigned confusion, even faked dizzy spells when Daniel helped her walk. And every time he smiled, so softly, so sympathetically, she wanted to scream. 3 days ago, she had started hiding the pills. She'd tuck them into the seam of a throw pillow or slip them under the edge of her rug. Yesterday, she had flushed one down the toilet while Daniel was adjusting her blanket. Since then, her mind had sharpened. The fog was lifting, slowly but certainly, and the more clarity she gained, the more disturbed she became. Daniel was monitoring her every move. Every drawer had been emptied and reorganized. Her phone had been quietly taken from her bedside to charge, but it hadn't returned. Even the old clock radio she once listened to was removed without explanation. When she asked about it, Daniel shrugged and said the static was giving him headaches. But worst of all, her journal was gone. The worn, leather-bound notebook she had written in every night since coming to the house, where she documented the strange sounds, Daniel's absences, the nurse's whisper, the odd smells, her fears, had vanished from its hiding place under her mattress. When she asked about it casually, Daniel simply said, "You probably misplaced it. You've been a little forgetful lately, haven't you?" Her fingers curled into fists beneath her blanket. Something was terribly wrong. That afternoon, Daniel sat beside her bed, watching her as she sipped lukewarm soup. His gaze never left her face. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "Are you feeling okay?" She offered a weak smile. "Just tired. You've been doing so much." He nodded. "You don't need to worry. I'll always take care of you, just like I promised." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and she felt her skin crawl. That touch, it was gentle but hollow. Performative. It reminded her of someone patting a pet, not a parent. She looked down at the spoon in her bowl and changed the subject. "Where do you go when you leave?" she asked carefully. "You've been gone longer lately." He paused just a second too long. "Just errands, groceries, supplies, the usual." She nodded, pretending to believe him. That night, Margaret made a decision. She wouldn't just suspect, she would know. After Daniel went to bed, always precisely at 9 p.m., she quietly pulled back her covers, slipped on her robe, and crept down the hallway with her walker. Each squeak of its wheels sounded like thunder in the dead silence. She didn't go to the basement door, she went to the kitchen. Daniel had recently installed a new cabinet high above the refrigerator, a place Margaret assumed he thought was beyond her reach. But she had been saving her energy for this. She dragged a chair from the table, climbed slowly and opened it. Inside, bottles. Dozens of them. Some labeled, some not. Medications with names she didn't recognize. Others scratched out entirely. There were syringes, brown vials, gauze pads, and an empty bottle bearing her name. Her dosage had been increased. without any doctor's consultation. She took one of the unfamiliar bottles and slipped it into her robe pocket just as a floorboard creaked from upstairs. Her heart stopped. Then silence. She climbed down, replaced the chair, and returned to her room with trembling limbs. In bed, she stared at the ceiling for hours, the bottle clutched to her chest. When dawn finally came, she was still awake. This was no longer just about suspicion. This was about survival. She had to figure out what Daniel was doing. And more importantly, who else he might have already done it to. The bottle Margaret had hidden now lay beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of her room. She'd wedged it between old socks and the sole of a forgotten slipper, wrapped tightly in an old dishcloth to muffle the rattle of the pills. Each time she stepped near it, she imagined the cold click of Daniel's voice behind her. "What do you think you're doing, Mom?" She had to move fast, gather evidence, remember clearly, document what she could. If he was drugging her, if he was hiding something behind that basement door, she needed to stay one step ahead, so she started a second journal. It was a cheap notebook she found tucked in the back of a kitchen drawer, behind dusty recipe cards and expired coupons. She kept it tucked beneath the cushion of her reading chair, disguised by a floral slipcover and a layer of dust she left deliberately undisturbed. Each entry was written slowly, deliberately, with trembling fingers and painfully steady strokes. She wrote about the tea, the medication, the changes in her cognition when she didn't take the pills. She wrote about Daniel's increasingly possessive behavior, the way he hovered, how he never really left her alone anymore, how the new nurse had vanished without explanation after her whispered warning. And she wrote about the door, the way Daniel tensed when she got too close, the low, rhythmic noises she sometimes heard at night, metal scraping, something shifting, a moan once, or maybe a cry. Daniel had become more cautious, more calculating. He watched her more closely. One afternoon, she noticed he had begun locking the cabinet with the medication. When she asked about it, he smiled tightly and said, "Just to keep things organized. You don't need to stress yourself with all that." Margaret played along. She smiled, she thanked him, she took the tea and pretended to drink it, pouring it down the bathroom sink. She swallowed empty pills she pretended to find beneath the bed. She started to memorize his habits, how he always showered at 7 p.m., how he left the basement key hanging from a tiny hook behind the pantry door when he forgot. And then, 3 nights later, the notebook disappeared. It happened sometime between her evening meal and the start of an old movie Daniel insisted she watch with him. When she returned to her chair after he had gone upstairs, the slipcover had been slightly disturbed. The cushion felt lighter, the notebook was gone. At first she stared at the space, refusing to believe it. Her heart thudded in her chest. Had she moved it? Had she hidden it somewhere else? She searched the room in frantic silence. Under the bed, behind the curtains, even the trash can. Gone. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the chair, shaking. He had found it. And worse, he hadn't said a word. The next morning, Daniel was all smiles. "Feeling better today?" he asked, bringing in a new tray with toast, fruit, and another cup of his carefully steeped tea. Margaret looked at the tray, then at him. "Much better?" she lied. His eyes lingered on her a little too long. "Good. You were muttering a lot in your sleep. Saying strange things. I almost called the doctor." "I don't remember," she said. He nodded. "That's okay. That's what I'm here for." He left the tray and walked away, humming a soft tune as he went. Margaret waited 5 full minutes after his footsteps faded, then reached for the tea, sniffed it, and poured it into a vase of wilted flowers. She watched the petals sag even further as the liquid soaked in. There would be no more writing. No more evidence. If she wanted to hold on to the truth, she would have to store it all in her head now. Names. Times. Clues. She began repeating them to herself like prayers. Linda. Basement. Scraping sounds. Pink pills. Missing journal. Locked drawer. Over and over, whispering them under her breath until they settled like iron into her bones. Daniel came in later that afternoon with a tray of cookies and a casual smile. "I thought we'd have a treat. You always liked shortbread." Margaret took a cookie and smiled. But in her mind, she wasn't eating shortbread. She was memorizing where the shadows fell in the hallway at night. She was planning how long it would take Daniel to reach her room from his. She was preparing. Because he had taken her voice once, he would not take her mind. The days stretched longer now, oppressive and sterile. The house no longer felt like a home, it felt like a carefully curated exhibit. Each corner was arranged with surgical precision, void of personality, stripped of warmth. Margaret noticed things now, tiny things. How Daniel wiped her fingerprints off the refrigerator handle, how he unplugged the landline at night, how the clocks all ran 5 minutes fast except the one in her room. She was a guest, yes, but one in a gilded cage. Then came the new nurse. Daniel had explained her arrival as routine, just a substitute. "Agency's short-staffed again," he said over scrambled eggs that tasted faintly metallic. "You'll like her. She's sweet." When the front door creaked open at exactly 9:03 a.m., Margaret heard the sound of cautious footsteps and then a voice, young, clear, uncertain. "Hi, Mrs. Lane?" Margaret turned toward the doorway, where a tall woman in her late 20s stood. She was dressed in the usual agency scrubs, but her posture betrayed her nerves. Her eyes darted quickly to the corners of the room before landing on Margaret. "I'm Nurse Elise," she said softly. "Just here for the morning." Daniel loomed behind her like a shadow, his smile as tight as ever. "I'll be back around lunchtime. Be good, Mom." He kissed the top of her head, too deliberately, and left with a flash of car keys and a hollow wave. When the doors shut, Margaret and Elise were left in tense silence. Margaret studied her face. Elise was trying too hard to appear normal. Her hands fidgeted. Her smile was practiced. They went through the morning routine: blood pressure, medication check, basic mobility exercises. Margaret pretended not to notice how Elise's eyes kept flicking toward the hallway. It wasn't until Elise helped her into a fresh nightgown that her hands lingered too long on Margaret's wrist. "You don't look like someone who needs this much help," Elise said under her breath. Margaret froze. "What did you say?" Elise's voice lowered to a whisper. "I read your old file." "From the hospital. You were improving fast. Should have been in rehab, not here, but someone closed the case. No reason listed." Margaret's throat tightened. "He said I'd be safer at home." Elise glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "He's hiding your records. I had to fight just to get this assignment." "Your old nurse? Linda?" "She's gone. No one at the agency knows where." A beat passed. The house creaked as if listening. Margaret's voice cracked. "Did she say anything before she left?" Elise hesitated, then whispered, "She left a note for me in the locker room. It said, 'You're not the only one he's kept here.'" The words settled like ice in Margaret's chest. "What does that mean?" she asked, heart pounding. "I don't know," Elise said, standing up quickly. "But I think you're in danger." They were silent again, as footsteps echoed above them. Elise's head snapped upward. "I thought he left," Margaret said quietly. "He might have come back." Quickly, Elise resumed her nurse routine, fluffing pillows, checking vitals, humming tunelessly. When Daniel finally reappeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, Margaret was back in bed, and Elise was scribbling notes on a clipboard. "How was everything?" he asked, his smile never reaching his eyes. Elise looked up and smiled perfectly. "Great, she's improving." Daniel walked her to the door, and before she left, Elise turned and looked directly at Margaret. "Keep resting," she said. "You'll be back on your feet sooner than you think." When the door closed, Margaret turned to the wall and tried to breathe. She stayed there for a long time. That night, after Daniel kissed her forehead and turned off the lights, she didn't sleep. She stared into the dark with open eyes, her pulse steady but her mind racing. Not the only one. Linda had warned her. Elise had confirmed it. There was someone else, some other presence in this house, someone unseen, someone forgotten, someone locked away, perhaps beneath her very feet. The next time Daniel left, she would find out, even if it was the last thing she did. The house had never felt so suffocating. Each creak of the wooden floors echoed like a secret being whispered into the shadows. Margaret lay awake in her hospital bed, the soft hum of the heating system her only companion. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, tugging at the old house's bones like an invisible hand demanding entrance. Her thoughts, however, were louder than any storm. She had been counting the days since Nurse Elise's warning. "You're not the only one he's kept here." Those words haunted her relentlessly. The locked basement door had transformed from a curiosity to a terrifying riddle. Earlier that afternoon, while Daniel was out tending to the small vegetable patch behind the house, Margaret had found herself once again drawn toward the basement. Her fingers had brushed against the cold iron latch, the metal biting into her skin. She wanted to pry it open, to see what lay beyond, but fear rooted her in place. Instead, she had retreated to the window, gazing out at the wild undergrowth. But even the fresh air couldn't clear the weight settling on her chest. As twilight bled into night, the house seemed to breathe around her. The shadows lengthened, swallowing the edges of her room. It was then the whisper began. Soft. Tentative. Barely audible. Margaret's eyes snapped open. At first, she thought it was the wind, or perhaps the house settling, as old houses did. But the sound was too deliberate, too human. "Margaret!" She froze. The voice was a fragile thread, calling her name like a prayer in the dark. Heart pounding, she sat up, gripping the edges of the blanket. The whisper came again. "Help me." Her mind raced. Was she dreaming? Or had someone been trapped down there all along? Gathering her courage, she reached for the call button on her bedside table, but paused. Daniel was downstairs in the kitchen. She didn't want him to come rushing in. Not yet. The whisper came a third time, more urgent now, echoing faintly from behind the walls themselves. "Please." Margaret's gaze drifted to the door. The heavy basement door. Summoning all her strength, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and steadied herself on her walker. Her limbs ached, but the resolve burning inside her was fiercer than pain. Creeping into the dim hallway, she moved toward the basement, each wheeled step slow but purposeful. Reaching the door, she pressed her ear again to the wood. There it was, a faint scrape, like metal dragging along concrete. A shudder ran through her spine. Her fingers found the iron latch. It was locked tight. Desperation clawed at her. She searched the floor, running her hands along the baseboard until she found a small key hanging on a nail behind the pantry door, a key she hadn't seen before. With trembling hands, she pulled it free. Her breath caught as she fit it into the lock. The tumblers clicked, and the door creaked open, releasing a stale, cold breath that smelled of damp earth and forgotten things. She peered into the darkness. The basement was a narrow, stone-walled room, illuminated only by a faint glow from an old hanging bulb swinging gently overhead. And then her eyes adjusted. There, curled on a threadbare mattress, was a woman. Her hair was tangled and gray, her clothes ragged. She looked like a ghost, frail but alive. When she caught sight of Margaret, she blinked rapidly, her eyes wide with shock and relief. "Margaret," the woman whispered hoarsely. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It was a voice she hadn't heard in decades, a face she thought was buried in the past. Alice, her sister. The sister Margaret thought had died 30 years ago. Frozen in place, they stared at each other, years of silence and secrets filling the space between them. Margaret's mind spun, questions rushing like a torrent. How was this possible? Why had Daniel locked her away? What had happened to Alice all these years? The basement door creaked shut behind her. Some promises, she realized, held darker truths than she could have ever imagined. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as her eyes locked with the frail figure on the threadbare mattress. Time had been unkind to Alice, her once bright eyes now dulled by years of neglect and isolation, her tangled hair falling in gray matted strands. But the recognition was unmistakable. It was her sister, the sister she had mourned for 3 decades, the sister whose disappearance had shattered their family. Alice? Margaret's voice trembled, barely more than a whisper. The woman's lips parted in surprise, then slowly curled into a weak smile. Margaret, is it really you? Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, blurring the dim light that flickered overhead. The years of pain, anger, and unanswered questions surged forward in a flood. She wanted to rush to her sister, to hold her, to ask how this had happened, but her legs trembled beneath her. She remained rooted to the spot, as though the weight of decades pressed down on her shoulders. How? Why are you here? Margaret finally found the courage to ask. Alice's eyes flickered with something Margaret couldn't immediately place. Fear? Resignation? A shadow of sorrow that seemed to have seeped into her bones. It's a long story, she said, voice rough from disuse. One I wasn't sure you'd believe if I told it. Margaret sat on the edge of the mattress, careful not to startle her sister. Try me, she said softly. Alice swallowed hard. After I disappeared, I didn't want to be found. There were things in our family that needed burying, secrets that could destroy us all. Margaret's heart pounded. But Daniel, why would he keep you here, locked away like this? Alice's gaze flicked toward the basement door, as if expecting it to open at any moment. He thinks he's protecting you, protecting us, but really, he's trapped us. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. The house wasn't just a prison for her, it was a cage for her sister too, a cage built from lies, fear, and decades-old grudges. Daniel, he's changed, Alice continued. The boy I knew, the man he's become. I hardly recognize him anymore. After I disappeared, he was lost, confused. But then, the bitterness took hold. Margaret's mind raced back to memories long suppressed, arguments between her and Alice, the day Alice vanished without a trace, the whispers of betrayal and heartbreak. Had Daniel really believed the stories he'd been told? Had he been manipulated into this? I don't know what's real anymore, Margaret admitted, tears slipping down her cheeks. But I do know this. I won't leave you here. Alice's eyes glistened with gratitude. I never stopped hoping you'd come. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the stairs above. Both women froze. Margaret's heart leapt in her chest. Daniel's voice called down, Mom, are you okay down there? Alice's face tightened with fear. Margaret reached out, gripping her sister's hand. We have to be careful, she whispered. He can't find out we're here together. Daniel's footsteps descended cautiously, each step measured and deliberate. Margaret hurriedly looked around the basement for anything that could be used as a weapon or a tool. Her gaze settled on a rusty metal rod, leaning against the far wall. As Daniel's shadow loomed at the doorway, Margaret clutched the rod tightly, ready to protect her sister. But Daniel merely glanced down at the two of them, his eyes narrowing. Why are you in the basement, Mom? He demanded. Margaret forced calm into her voice. I was just exploring, needed some fresh air. Alice has been feeling ill. She needed rest. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. This is for your own good. For both of you. His words felt like chains tightening around her heart. Alice squeezed Margaret's hand. We need to get out. Margaret nodded. She didn't know how yet, but she knew one thing for certain. The promises Daniel made, the ones he kept, had turned into a nightmare. And it was time to fight back. Margaret had always believed she knew her son. Quiet, thoughtful Daniel. The boy who had once cried when she killed a spider. The boy who refused to leave her bedside after his father died. The boy who made her promise they'd never be apart. But the man pacing the floor upstairs, locking doors and rationing her medication, he was a stranger wearing her son's face. Back in the basement, she sat with Alice in stunned silence. The air was thick with dust and old secrets. The single light bulb cast long, untrustworthy shadows across the stone walls. A faint draft whistled through a crack above the door, reminding Margaret that the outside world was still there, close enough to feel but not to touch. "You said Daniel thinks he's protecting us," Margaret finally said. "From what?" Alice sighed. Her voice was raspier now, weakened by years of silence. "From the truth, I suppose, but the version he believes isn't exactly the one that happened." "Then tell me," Margaret said firmly. "Tell me what happened after you disappeared." Alice looked down at her hands, thin and bruised. "You remember the fights we had, don't you? About Dad's will? About the house? About how he left everything to you?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I offered to split it. You refused." "I didn't refuse," Alice said bitterly. "I said I didn't want scraps. I said I wanted what was mine, and then you vanished." "I ran," Alice confessed, voice cracking. "I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to grovel. So I left. I hitchhiked across state lines, lived in shelters for a while. I didn't want anyone to find me, not even Daniel. But then I got sick, and I came back." Margaret's eyes widened. "When?" 10 years ago." The weight of those words slammed into her like a blow. 10? But Daniel never said. "He didn't know right away," Alice said. "I found him first. I was staying at a halfway house in the city. I called him. I just wanted a place to rest, to figure things out, but he didn't want to hear it. He said I'd abandoned him, and you. He said you told him I stole money from Dad." "I never said that," Margaret whispered, stunned. Alice looked up. "Well, someone did." Margaret's stomach churned. He was just a boy. Confused. Grieving. He must have built his own version of events. "And I let him," Alice admitted. "I was too weak to argue. So I stayed. At first, just for a few nights. Then a week. Then months. But things changed." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Changed how?" "He got possessive. Controlling. He'd ration my food. Check my calls. Tell me I needed him. And then one day, I said I was leaving." Alice paused, eyes hollow. "That's when he locked the door." Margaret covered her mouth in horror. "And he's kept you here ever since?" Alice nodded. "He brings me food, medicine, talks to me like I'm a patient. Or a child, like I don't know what's real anymore." Margaret stood and paced the narrow room. "He's rewritten history. For both of us. And now you're part of it," Alice said quietly. Margaret turned to face her. "No, not for long. We're getting out of here." "How?" Alice asked, her voice both hopeful and afraid. "I don't know yet," Margaret said, "but I do know this. I was wrong. I thought I raised a kind boy, a gentleman, but I raised someone broken, and now I have to fix what I let fester." That evening, Margaret returned to her room above, careful to close the basement door behind her without a sound. Daniel was sitting at the dining table, smiling at her with unsettling ease. "Everything okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I was just stretching my legs." "You shouldn't push yourself," he said. "You're getting stronger, but you're still fragile." "I know," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm remembering things now, and that helps." Daniel's eyes flickered, just for a moment. A ripple of uncertainty crossed his face. "Good," he said after a beat. "We all forget things sometimes, even important ones." Margaret met his gaze. "Not anymore," she said. As she ate the bland dinner he'd prepared, her mind raced through possibilities. There had to be a way to reach someone, to find help, to outsmart him. The lies had lived long enough. It was time for the truth to surface, even if it destroyed them all. The air in the house had shifted. Margaret felt it in the way the floor groaned more suspiciously beneath her walker, and how Daniel lingered longer after meals, watching her with that eerie, unreadable smile. He was sensing change, sniffing out rebellion, and he was right to. Something inside her had turned. The old Margaret, quiet, docile, grieving, was gone. Now there was only one objective: escape. Margaret had spent the past 3 nights lying awake in her bed, replaying every word, every clue Alice had given her. Their whispered reunions in the basement had grown longer, more urgent. They timed Daniel's footsteps, mapped his routine, and committed to memory every sound that signaled his movements, from the groan of the fridge door to the snap of the light switch at 9:05 p.m. "He always locks the front door before bed," Alice said. "But he uses the back entrance after gardening. He keeps the key in his coat. And he hangs his coat on the rack by the pantry," Margaret added. "Exactly. You get the key. We wait until he's in the shower. That's when the pipes groan. He won't hear a thing." They spoke in fragments, careful not to speak too long or too loud. Even the walls, they feared, had ears in this house. But the risks were real. They both knew it. If Daniel found out, there would be no second chance. Margaret had seen glimpses of something darker in him. His fixation with routine, the veiled threats behind his kindness, the way his hand had clenched into a white-knuckled fist when he discovered she'd left her room without asking. He was unraveling, and the tighter he felt control slipping, the more dangerous he became. On the 4th night, the plan was set in motion. Daniel had gone out to tend to his greenhouse, a space she now knew he used to grow not just vegetables but medicinal herbs. That explained the strange flavors in her tea and why the nurses never stayed long. He was blending lies with nature, masking control as care. Margaret waited until she heard the familiar creak of the greenhouse door. Then, with her pulse drumming in her ears, she crept to the coat rack. The key was tucked inside a zippered pocket of his jacket. She fumbled with shaking fingers, every second stretching into an eternity. Footsteps on gravel. She froze. Daniel was coming back. She yanked the key free, shoved it into her robe pocket, and shuffled as quickly as she could toward the kitchen. She reached her chair just as the front door creaked open. Daniel stepped inside, brushing dirt from his hands. He glanced at her. "Still awake?" he asked. Margaret smiled weakly. "Couldn't sleep." He watched her for a long moment, then nodded. "Well, maybe some tea would help." "No thanks," she said quickly. "My stomach's unsettled tonight." Something flickered behind his eyes, suspicion. But he said nothing. He disappeared into the back hallway. Margaret exhaled slowly. She clutched the key in her pocket like it was a lifeline. That night, at 9:03 p.m., the pipes began to groan overhead. Daniel was in the shower. Margaret moved. She crept to the basement door and unlocked it, wincing as the latch clicked louder than she'd expected. She slipped inside and descended the stairs where Alice waited, already dressed in an old coat and boots. "You got it?" Alice whispered. Margaret nodded and held up the key. "We have to go now," she said. "He won't be long." They climbed the stairs quietly, the weight of years pressing against every step. In the kitchen, they headed to the back door. Margaret slipped the key into the lock. It jammed. "No, no, no," she whispered, hands trembling. She turned it again. Click! The door swung open. A cold wind greeted them. Wet grass, real air, a world beyond the walls. But just as they stepped onto the porch, "Where do you think you're going?" Daniel's voice was low, menacing. He stood at the edge of the hallway, soaking wet from the shower, a towel draped around his shoulders, and something glinting in his hand. Something metallic. Margaret's blood froze. Alice clutched her arm. Daniel stepped forward slowly, blocking the light, casting them both in shadow. "I kept my promise," he said. "You said you never wanted to be put away, and I didn't. I kept you safe. I kept us all together." Margaret met his gaze, voice calm, defiant. "No, Daniel, you kept us trapped." The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. They had one chance left, and it was now or never. The wind howled through the trees as Margaret and Alice stood frozen on the porch, Daniel's silhouette cutting across the kitchen's golden light behind them. The towel slung over his shoulder dripped steadily onto the hardwood, but his hand, the one clutching the cold glint of steel, was steady, too steady. "You don't have to do this," Margaret said calmly, though her insides were unraveling. "I already did," Daniel replied, stepping closer. "I gave everything up, my job, my friends, my future. I stayed here to take care of you, and her." His eyes flicked toward Alice with an intensity that made her shrink against Margaret's shoulder. "I kept my promise." "No," Margaret said, firmer now. "You twisted it. You turned love into control. You didn't keep a promise. You built a prison." His jaw clenched. "You both don't understand. The world out there? It would have broken you. Mom, the hospital was going to send you to some government-run facility, alone, forgotten. But I saved you." "And Alice?" Margaret asked. "Was she part of the promise too? Or just a secret to hide?" Daniel didn't answer. The silence was enough. Alice stepped forward, voice trembling but resolute. "I never wanted any of this. I came back for help, not a life sentence." Daniel shook his head slowly, eyes wide with something between grief and delusion. No one understood, not then, not now. As he stepped forward again, Margaret subtly shifted her weight. Her walker stood just beside her, weighted by the ceramic flower pot she'd hidden inside the pouch. Heavy, solid. When Daniel raised the tool in his hand, a wrench, not a knife, but dangerous enough, Margaret moved. With a sharp cry, she swung the walker sideways. The pot smashed into Daniel's shin with a dull thud. He cried out in pain and stumbled, giving Alice just enough time to shove the porch door wide open. "Run!" Margaret screamed. They dashed out into the yard, grass slick beneath their feet. Daniel was close behind, limping but fast, rage giving speed to his battered leg. The night air whipped around them, the stars above blurred as tears stung Margaret's eyes. She wasn't sure how far they'd get, but this time she'd die on her feet, not in that bed, not in silence. They passed the greenhouse. The windows glowed faintly from a solar bulb Daniel had installed. Alice veered toward it. "In here!" she shouted. They slammed the door shut behind them and jammed the latch. Daniel's figure appeared seconds later, banging on the glass. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "Don't make me force you back." "We're not going back," Margaret said, panting. "Not ever." Alice was already fumbling with the emergency cell phone Daniel kept locked in a drawer for power outages. She'd seen it weeks ago during one of his late-night greenhouse repairs. "It still works," she breathed, pressing the digits with shaking fingers. The operator's voice came through. Alice rattled off the address. Margaret leaned against the wall, her body screaming with pain but her heart steady. "Help is coming, Daniel." His face twisted. He raised the wrench again, but then sirens in the distance, growing closer. His hand dropped. Blue and red lights streaked across the trees. Daniel backed away slowly, face pale, drenched in sweat and confusion. He didn't run. He just stared at Margaret as the cruiser door slammed and two officers surged toward the greenhouse. He whispered something she barely heard. "I just wanted to keep my family." The officers grabbed him, wrestled him to the ground. The wrench clattered to the floor. Margaret turned away. 2 months later, Margaret sat in a quiet rehabilitation center. Not the sterile warehouse she'd feared, but a warm, cozy home in the hills near the coast. Alice sat beside her, healthier every day, color returning to her cheeks. They played cards on the porch in the morning sun. "I still can't believe he's gone," Alice said quietly. Margaret nodded, eyes distant. "Not gone, just somewhere he can't hurt anyone anymore." They both stared into the horizon. The story Daniel told himself had ended. But theirs? Theirs had just begun again. Rewritten in the ashes of captivity, stitched together with the fragile threads of truth, forgiveness, and freedom. Margaret looked down at her hands. Stronger now, steadier. "I made him a promise once," she murmured, "but I owe myself one too." Alice looked at her. "What's that?" "That I'll never be caged again." They sat in silence, free, together, at last.